In the summer of 1859, two of the most powerful empires on Earth pointed loaded cannons at each other across a stretch of water in the Pacific Northwest. On one side, 461 American soldiers, dug into fortifications on a small island, stared across the harbor at 5 British warships carrying 2,140 men and 70 guns. Neither side had been ordered to fire. Neither side had been ordered to stand down. For weeks, both armies conducted live-fire drills within range of each other. The British hurling solid shot into the bluffs along the harbor, the Americans manning artillery positions built on high ground overlooking the fleet. Tourists arrived on excursion boats from the nearest city to watch the spectacle. What made this confrontation remarkable was not its scale, though the scale was significant. It was not the strategic importance of the territory, though the territory would prove consequential. What made it remarkable was the reason it started. A farmer had shot a pig. In June of 1846, the United States and Great Britain signed a treaty resolving a long-standing territorial dispute over the Pacific Northwest. The agreement was straightforward in principle. The border between American and British territory would follow the 49th parallel, a line already established across much of the continental interior, from the Rocky Mountains to the coast. But at the coast, the negotiators faced a problem. The 49th parallel did not hit the Pacific Ocean cleanly. It terminated in a maze of islands, straits, and channels separating the mainland from Vancouver Island, which was indisputably British. The treaty's solution was a single sentence stating that the border would continue along the 49th parallel to the middle of the channel, separating the continent from Vancouver Island, and then southerly through the middle of the channel and the Strait of Juan de Fuca to the Pacific. The word channel, however, was doing more work than it could support. There were 2 possible channels. Haro Strait ran along the western side of a cluster of islands called the San Juan Islands, placing them on the American side of the border. Rosario Strait ran along the eastern side, placing them on the British side. The San Juan Islands sat between these 2 waterways. Both nations claimed them. The treaty, despite its apparent finality, had left the question open. It is widely believed that this ambiguity was deliberate. The negotiators, focused on resolving the larger continental boundary, appear to have accepted the vagueness as a temporary compromise, a problem for future diplomats to solve. It was not solved for 13 years. During that time, both nations established competing presences on the largest of the disputed islands, San Juan Island itself. The British moved first. In 1851, the Hudson's Bay Company, operating from its headquarters at Fort Victoria on nearby Vancouver Island, established salmon curing stations along San Juan Island's western shore. By 1853, the company had opened a large sheep farm on the island's southern end, a commercially profitable operation that also served as a convenient assertion of British sovereignty. The flock grew quickly. Within 6 years, over 4,500 sheep grazed across the island. The Americans arrived more slowly. Under the Donation Land Claim Act of 1850, settlers could stake claims to territory in the Oregon Country. By the spring of 1859, 18 American families had established homesteads on San Juan Island, many of them on land the Hudson's Bay Company considered its own. By the summer of 1859, the island held 2 communities, 2 legal systems, and 2 flags living side by side in an increasingly untenable arrangement. Something was going to give. On June 15, 1859, exactly 13 years to the day after the Oregon Treaty was signed, an American farmer named Lyman Cutler walked out to his garden on the southern end of San Juan Island and found a pig eating his potatoes. This was not the first time. The pig belonged to Charles John Griffin, an Irishman employed by the Hudson's Bay Company to manage the Bellevue sheep farm. Griffin kept several pigs and allowed them to roam freely across the island. They had been getting into Cutler's garden repeatedly. Cutler shot the pig. He immediately regretted the impulse. Cutler went to Griffin, explained what had happened, and offered $10 in compensation, a fair price for a pig roughly equivalent to several weeks' wages. Griffin demanded $100. The two men could not agree. According to most accounts of the incident, Cutler argued that the pig had been trespassing on his land, and that he should not have to pay full price for an animal that had no business being there. Griffin maintained that the animal's value was the animal's value, regardless of where it had been standing when it died. The exchange allegedly produced one of the more famous lines in the history of territorial disputes. When Cutler protested that the pig had been eating his potatoes, Griffin reportedly replied that it was up to Cutler to keep his potatoes out of his pig. The quote is almost certainly apocryphal. No contemporaneous record preserves it, and it has the hallmarks of a line polished by generations of retelling. But it captures the essential logic of the disagreement and the increasingly absurd trajectory of what followed. The Hudson's Bay Company did not treat the incident as a private matter between two farmers. Company officials informed Cutler that he was living on British soil, that his land claim was invalid, and that under British law he could be arrested for trespassing and livestock destruction. A.G. Dallas, the president of the company's board and the son-in-law of the governor of Vancouver Island, personally visited Cutler to deliver the message. Cutler and his fellow settlers, alarmed, drafted a petition to the American military commander at Fort Vancouver, requesting protection. The petition made no mention of a pig. Instead, it cited the threat of raids by indigenous groups from the north, a framing that, whatever its accuracy, gave the military a more conventional justification for intervention. On July 4, 1859, about 14 Americans gathered at the cabin of a deputy customs collector named Paul Hubbs. They gave speeches, fired their guns in celebration of Independence Day, and raised an American flag on a newly constructed 55-foot flagpole. The flag rose, according to Hubbs' later recollection, amid showers of bullets fired into the air. It was visible for miles. The man who responded to the settlers' petition was Brigadier General William S. Harney, commander of the Department of Oregon, based at Fort Vancouver. Harney was 58 years old, known for bravery, a foul temper, a vulgar tongue, and a deep suspicion of British intentions in the region. He was also known for acting without waiting for authorization. On July 11th, without consulting territorial authorities, without waiting for orders from Washington, and without informing his superiors, Harney ordered a military detachment to San Juan Island. On July 27th, Captain George E. Pickett landed on the island with 64 men from Company D of the 9th United States Infantry, transported by the USS Massachusetts. Pickett was a Virginian who would, 4 years later, lead the catastrophic infantry assault at Gettysburg that would bear his name, one of the defining disasters of the American Civil War. But in the summer of 1859, his task was to establish an American military presence on a disputed island in the Pacific Northwest. He positioned his force on the high ground overlooking the harbor and began constructing fortifications. The British responded quickly. HMS Tribune, a 31-gun steam frigate under Captain Geoffrey Phipps Hornby, arrived in late July. Hornby was under direct orders from Sir James Douglas, the governor of Vancouver Island, to land Royal Marines and dislodge the Americans. Hornby refused. Instead, he invited Pickett to meet. The two officers negotiated at the American camp. Pickett told Hornby plainly that if British troops attempted to land, he would stop them. Hornby, for his part, declined to take action until his superior, Rear Admiral R. Lambert Baines, arrived to assess the situation personally. Baines arrived in late August with the full British Pacific Fleet, 5 warships carrying 2,140 troops and 70 guns. He was a veteran of the Battle of New Orleans in 1815, where he had fought against the Americans in the War of 1812. Governor Douglas ordered Baines to use this overwhelming force to remove the Americans. Baines refused. He reportedly told Douglas that he would not involve 2 great nations in a war over a squabble about a pig. The quote has survived for over a century and a half because it is perfectly pitched, dry, devastating, and absolutely correct. Baines recognized what Douglas, in his eagerness to assert British sovereignty, had failed to see, that the island was not worth the cost of taking it by force. Meanwhile, the American presence continued to grow. On August 10th, Lieutenant Colonel Silas Casey arrived with 171 additional soldiers. By the end of August, the American force on San Juan Island numbered 461 men, supported by 14 field cannons and 8 additional naval guns emplaced in a redoubt on the high ground. The man who supervised the construction of that redoubt was Lieutenant Henry Martin Robert. He was a young engineer officer who would later become famous for an entirely different contribution to American civic life. He wrote Robert's Rules of Order, the parliamentary procedure manual that remains, to this day, the most widely used guide to conducting meetings in the English-speaking world. The fortification he built on San Juan Island is considered the best preserved example of its kind in the United States. It is still standing. By late August, the 2 forces faced each other across the harbor. The Americans dug in on the hillside, the British fleet anchored in the bay. Both conducted drills. Both conducted live-fire exercises. Neither fired at the other. And tourists came to watch. Visitors arrived on excursion boats from Victoria, the capital of Vancouver Island, and stood on the decks observing British military maneuvers as afternoon entertainment. It was, by any reasonable measure, an absurd situation. 2 armies, tens of thousands of rounds of ammunition, and the full attention of 2 governments, all because a farmer shot a pig. By September of 1859, the crisis had reached Washington. President James Buchanan, informed that a dispute over a dead pig had escalated into a military standoff involving nearly 3,000 troops and a fleet of warships, made a decision that would prove decisive. He sent General Winfield Scott to the Pacific Northwest to negotiate a resolution. Scott was 73 years old. He was the General-in-Chief of the United States Army, the highest-ranking military officer in the country, and he had already spent a long career managing crises. He had previously diffused 2 border disputes with Britain in the late 1830s, and he was known for patience, caution, and a willingness to talk when others wanted to fight. He was also known for moving slowly. Reaching San Juan Island from New York required a 6-week journey via the Isthmus of Panama, and Scott did not hurry. He arrived in October. He communicated with Governor Douglas through messengers. He visited the American position. He assessed the situation. And then he proposed the only reasonable solution. Both sides would withdraw their reinforcements and leave a token garrison on the island, no more than 100 men each, until the question of sovereignty could be resolved through diplomacy. Douglas agreed. Both governments approved the arrangement in November of 1859. The immediate crisis was over. General Harney, whose unauthorized escalation had nearly started a war, was officially rebuked. He was eventually reassigned. His insubordination had pushed the situation past the point where local commanders could manage it, and it had taken the personal intervention of the Army's highest-ranking officer to walk it back. Captain Pickett, whose defiance had impressed his own troops and alarmed the British, remained on the island for several months before being transferred. 4 years later, he would lead the ill-fated assault at Gettysburg that would define his legacy. Captain Hornby, whose refusal to follow Governor Douglas's orders had prevented the first shots from being fired, was promoted. He eventually rose to Admiral of the Fleet, the highest rank in the Royal Navy, and became one of the most celebrated naval tacticians of the Victorian era. And Admiral Baines, the man who refused to fight a war over a pig, returned to duty. He had spent his career in uniform, including a tour fighting against the Americans, and he ended it as the man who chose not to start another fight with them. For the next 12 years, San Juan Island was occupied by both nations simultaneously. The Americans maintained their camp at the island's southern end, near Griffin Bay. The British established their camp on the northwestern coast at Garrison Bay in March of 1860, a position they called English Camp. What followed was one of the more peculiar episodes in the history of international relations. The two garrisons lived in proximity, maintained separate command structures, and did not fight each other. But they also did not ignore each other. The officers and soldiers of both nations developed what historians have described as an amicable social life. They visited each other's camps to celebrate national holidays, Americans attending British celebrations, Britons attending American ones. They held athletic competitions. They attended church services together aboard British warships. They shared meals and, by multiple accounts, considerable quantities of whiskey and cigars at Charles Griffin's home, the very man whose pig had started the entire affair. According to later recollections by park rangers, the greatest threat to peace on the island during the years of joint occupation was not military tension. It was the large amounts of alcohol available. The world, however, did not stand still while two small garrisons shared drinks on a Pacific island. In 1861, the American Civil War began, consuming the attention and resources of the United States government for 4 years. British officials on the mainland lobbied London to seize the San Juan Islands while America was occupied with its own internal conflict. London declined. In 1866, the colony of Vancouver Island merged with the colony of British Columbia. In 1871, the enlarged colony joined the newly formed Dominion of Canada. On May 8, 1871, the two nations signed the Treaty of Washington, resolving a series of outstanding disputes, including the question of the San Juan Islands. The treaty referred the sovereignty question to international arbitration. At the insistence of American Secretary of State Hamilton Fish, the terms of the arbitration were carefully defined. The arbitrator would be required to choose between the two proposed boundaries, Haro Strait or Rosario Strait, without authority to impose a compromise. This was a critical diplomatic victory for the United States because it meant the islands would go to one nation or the other, not be divided. The arbitrator chosen was Kaiser Wilhelm I of Germany. The choice was partly strategic. George Bancroft, the American representative, was the United States ambassador to Germany and had been involved in negotiating the original Oregon Treaty. He knew the documents. The Kaiser appointed a 3-man commission. The commission met in Geneva for nearly a year. Bancroft argued that Haro Strait was the intended boundary because Rosario Strait was an insignificant channel on the maps of the era. The British argued that Rosario Strait was safer for navigation and more commonly used. On October 21, 1872, the Commission ruled 2-1 in favor of the United States. The boundary would follow Haro Strait. The San Juan Islands were American. On November 25, 1872, the British Royal Marines withdrew from English camp. According to accounts of the departure, the farewell was friendly. The British settlers who had lived on the island for years simply became American citizens. Life continued. In July of 1874, the last American troops departed. The Army auctioned off the buildings and opened the land to homestead claims. The Pig War was over. The final count of the Pig War was 1 dead pig, 0 dead humans. No soldiers on either side were killed, wounded, or even injured in combat. Two of the most powerful nations on Earth had deployed nearly 3,000 troops, 14 cannons, 5 warships, and 70 naval guns to a small island in the Pacific Northwest, and not a single shot had been fired in anger. The resolution, a diplomatic arbitration based on cartographic evidence, set a precedent that would influence international law for decades. In 1903, the same framework was used to resolve the Alaska boundary dispute between the same two nations. The Pig War had demonstrated that territorial conflicts between great powers could be resolved without bloodshed. The border that Kaiser Wilhelm's commission drew through Harrow Strait in 1872 remains the international boundary between the United States and Canada to this day. San Juan Island is the last piece of American soil that was ever occupied by Great Britain, and the individual stories scattered through the event would each find their own strange extensions in history. The farmer who shot the pig lived out his days on the island he had helped claim for his country. The man who built the American fortification went on to write the rules by which democracies conduct their meetings. The captain who defied his governor became the highest-ranking officer in the Royal Navy. The general who started the crisis was punished for his recklessness, and the admiral who ended it went back to sea, having done the single most important thing a military officer can do, chosen not to fight. The Pig War has been told and retold for over a century and a half. Some versions emphasize the comedy, a pig, a garden, 2 empires. Others emphasize the diplomacy, the restraint, the negotiation, the precedent. Both are true, but what the story ultimately illustrates is something simpler and more durable than either comedy or diplomacy. The war did not happen because one side was stronger, or smarter, or more principled. The war did not happen because one side backed down. The war did not happen because a farmer shot a pig, or because a farm manager demanded too much money, or because a governor gave reckless orders. The war did not happen because individual people, soldiers, officers, admirals, diplomats, chose, in a moment of tension, to act with restraint rather than obedience. That is the part of the story worth remembering. Not the pig. The pig was a Berkshire boar. It weighed, by the standards of the breed, a moderate amount. It cost somewhere between $10 and $100, depending on whom you asked. It was eating potatoes in a garden on a small island in the Pacific Northwest on a June morning in 1859. It did not know it was standing on disputed territory. It did not know that the ground beneath its hooves was claimed by 2 empires. It did not know that the farmer who shot it would trigger a chain of events involving warships, fortifications, diplomatic crises, and international arbitration. It was a pig, it was eating potatoes, that is all it knew. The men who inherited the crisis it created knew considerably more, and most of them, in the end, knew enough to put their weapons down.